Hey, what's up? Coach Patrick here, Endurance Nation, back with another Coach Video Cast podcast. This week's topic is about making the most of your long run. If you are an endurance athlete, whether you are a triathlete, a marathoner, ultra runner, or just an endurance athlete in general, perhaps even in your sort of baseline training, we have a long run not only within our week, but we have a long run within the context of our season as well. In this specific case, I'm talking about those longer runs that kind of go over 90 minutes. For me as a coach and even as an athlete, once you hit 90 minutes and start to move beyond that, you're entering a realm where we are truly in that endurance space. Whether or not you believe in fueling or whatever your nutritional beliefs may be, once you hit 90 minutes and are moving beyond that, we enter a different space where we can no longer rely just simply on our body. We need to have nutrition with us. It's an undertaking that we know requires some preparation, which I'll talk about in a second, but it also requires recovery as well on the other side. And so these 90 minutes and north long runs are the ones that become really critical sort of in the endurance space of your season. I want to be as successful as possible with them, right? So and the reason why I say that is because when things go wrong in a long run, they start to impact the rest of your training, the rest of your week, okay? Let's talk about what some of those examples are because they're fun and exciting, and hopefully they'll never happen to you, right? Some people work this way. We'll just cross things off. So first thing we want to cross off is running out of fuel. Here in the US, we call it bonking, not what perhaps other people would call bonking, but it means to run out and to basically end up flat and unable to be able to do the work you want to do because nutritionally speaking, you just your glycogen is low, your ability to do work has been compromised just simply by the situation you're in. So that's an easy mistake to fix. It happens to most people at least once, sort of epically in your life. You never go back there again. And at least once a season, I find where you think you can kind of get away with it, but you couldn't, and then you suffer for the end. So springtime's a great example for that, where, for example, I'm running 10 miles on my long run every week now. And, 2 weeks ago, 10 miles was done in 50-degree weather. It was great. I could kind of wing it, didn't have to worry about it. This past weekend, those 10 miles were done. It was 25 degrees warmer. And there was a good wind blowing as well from a tailwind, which meant that I was hot. And I didn't feel any breeze at all because the wind was behind me. It was significantly more costly to me. And thankfully, I was able to plan ahead and I had my nutrition with me, probably out of just fear of totally running out of energy somewhere. But solving that nutrition piece becomes really important. Another thing that we don't want to have go wrong on our long run is just running out of energy because we did a bad job pacing. Every single long run is an opportunity to prepare yourself for race day. The last thing we want to do on race day is fly and die. Crash and burn. None of that stuff, right? We want to be super steady, super smart, and to be consistent and strong when others are not. And so we know that human beings are really bad at pacing, managing efforts. They don't have that good sort of internal speed governor, if you will. So I expect that your competition will have that. You also have that gene, but I'm hoping in the context of our training and learning from our materials that you want to turn that off because it is not your friend on race day. Maybe unless you're doing like a 5K race or something shorter. So we really have to be smart about our pacing, right? And then the last piece that people usually get spectacularly wrong is figuring out what is the ideal long run distance for them. Instead of saying, oh, okay, this is what I've been running and this is where I'm at. What's the next best long run I have? Most people start working backwards from the race and say, let's just call it a marathon. My marathon is in 6 weeks. I've got 3 more good long runs. If my longest run, I want to be 22 miles, then today could be like 20. I'll do 20 this week and 18 next, and then 22, and then I'll taper. That sounds reasonable, particularly for a good, healthy runner who's got a lot of good miles on their legs. But it doesn't take into context the runs you've done before in terms of long runs, nor does it take into context how you feel today. And so you may very well have a plan on the calendar or a workout on the calendar, but just the general fatigue of your training or perhaps life somehow conspired, either individually or together, to undermine your ability to do that run. And when you work in a reverse engineered way like that and just insert the run that makes the most sense coming backwards, you are ignoring where you're at right now, and you can easily put yourself in a position where the fatigue and stress from that run will remain in your body far longer, undermining other quality training opportunities and ultimately starting to affect your taper. So those are just kind of 3 examples about the long run that are, things that we want to avoid. But let's talk in a little more of a positive way about long running, because I love long running. I think it's a great mental space to be, but we want to do it right. So what are the hacks that we want to do? So step 1 for me when I think about my long runs is I want to know the weather. I want to know if it's going to be hot, if it's going to be cold, if it's going to be windy, or what I want to do. The weather, because I'm going to be outside for so long, is important because I need to bring my nutrition with me and I need to bring my gear with me. So if it's kind of intermediately cold, I might bring some gloves for a long run because I don't want to be carrying a jacket the whole time. So I may dress up a little bit with a base layer, but I've got those gloves if things do get cold. If they get warm, I can put those gloves into my waistband or a pocket or tuck it underneath the leg of my shorts, and I'll be fine, right? So the duration of the event then forces me to look at that weather and say, what is it that I really need for this session? If it's a hot run, then maybe I want to plan on carrying my nutrition or plan to have a pit stop somewhere. So regardless of what I'm planning to do with this week's long run, I really want to know the weather because the weather is what sets me up to be successful. In some cases, I may be manipulating my training so that I can intersect with parts of the weather that are most important to me. So if I'm doing a hotter race, I want to do my long run at a time of the day when the heat is up so I can be successful in that space. That's really, really important. When you think about being successful in that long run, you probably have a couple other parameters that are really important to you, okay? Another way that I think about breaking up that long run is working from what I've done before. And I mentioned this earlier in the do not do section, but it's important for us to think about now. And so one of the contexts for that in terms of being successful is making sure that your long run fits within the progression that you've had. So if you've done 12 miles 2 weeks ago and last week you did 14 miles, you can do anywhere from 14 to say 16 miles. That's fine. That fits. What we can't do is do 18 or 20 miles today, nor should we just do 8 because we haven't done enough work yet. So planning out the distance of your long run, good God, I've got racing on the brain, becomes important because it allows us to continue to have that run work in that natural progression. So while doing 12 the first time felt like a long run, doing 14 the next week didn't really feel very much. You really sort of feel just those last 2 miles. So similarly, with 16, you'll feel the same way. It'll just be sort of the addition of those last 2 miles instead of being in a place where we're really struggling and running out of energy and putting our body and systems at risk by overextending, right? That's an easy way to kind of think about that. Now, another example that we can kind of leverage the long run distance there into how we can be successful in the course of a long run is looking at loops. I'm a huge fan of loops. You call me Fruit Loops, you call me what you want. Running out, for example, if I've got a 20-mile run, I would rather do 4 5-mile loops than I would a 10-mile out and a 10-mile back. I love the loop concept because from my house, I've got lots of little 5-mile loops. So I can put 3 or 4 of them together to make my 20-mile run. I'm never that far from home. I'm never that far from food, from a restroom, from transitioning or changing something if the weather should change on me. More importantly, I'm not having to plan for what happens in the event that something in that second half of the run, that return trip goes wrong, right? So let's just say that I've got a 20-mile long run and I'm kind of nursing a little bit of a calf injury. If I go out and do 12 miles and then tweak my calf, well, I'm 8 miles from home, which is a good hour if I'm running, and if I'm walking, it's a good 3 hours, right? Which is no good for anybody in my family. And now I've got to find some way to get home, either through Uber or whatever it may be. And we don't want that, right? So really thinking about how to strategize things for your run, I strongly encourage you to take a look at loops as that option. It could be 4 5-mile loops. It could be 5 4-mile loops. It could be 2 8s and a 4. It could be 3 6s and a 2, right? It could be 10 6 4, whatever it is for you that makes sense. Really think about how you want to break that down so we get some variety in your training and we get the benefit of what it means to be close to home, right? Which I think for many of us becomes an important part of feeling comfortable in these long runs, feeling safe, and ultimately feeling in control. Okay. Another element that I want to think about for these long runs is setting some key parameters for myself in terms of the pacing goals that I want to set. And I'll be right back in a second. I'll tell you about those right after I let my dog outside to the back. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that little nature break for the pupster there. So really thinking about pacing goals for that long run. And specifically what I mean is, how do you want to structure your pacing such to create the training stress that you want on race day in a dose that's appropriate for this week? And so, generally speaking, when we look at long runs, our goal is either twofold. One is to maintain steady pacing. I want you to be steady across the whole run. If we can keep you steady across the whole run, then generally over time your heart rate will trend up as we sort of see that decoupling of heart rate and effort as a result of dehydration, fatigue, running out of food, etc., decreasing form and efficiency, right? And that's important because that just sort of general baseline running creates that stress just naturally through running, right? So steady pacing is key. As we move up the level from moving from competing to winning in the context of these long runs and this long run training, then doing something like a negative split run becomes more important. Negative split run will be something where that last half of the run is actually faster than the first half. For many of us, this happens just simply as we get older because the initial miles that we do have a component of sort of warming up. And by the end of our runs, we seem to be, running a little more smoothly. Our hips, our knees, everything's loosened up, and we can get more work done as we go down the course of the run. But intentionally, we want to focus on that as well because we want to do harder work. We want to do more work in the second half. The later you go in that long run, the more we get out of those miles, right? So if we're doing a 2-hour long run, the last half hour of those 2 hours is where the magic happens, right? The first half hour is just getting started. The middle hour is just being steady and fueling, getting ready. All of that preparation for that last half hour where we can be most successful, because that's where we're really going to build that fitness. That's where we're going to forge new ground. So you move from 12 miles to 14 miles or 14 miles to 16 miles, whatever it may be. That's where that really happens. And so that negative split run allows us to replicate some of the training stress that we'll have on race day, which would be more of a steady state run, by making things a little bit harder in a training run, and then learn from that experience, both from an internal sort of perceived exertion, internal governor perspective, from a nutritional perspective, and prepare ourselves, physiologically to be ready for the duration of that longer race. Because we don't go out and run 50 miles in a single go before our 50-mile race. We don't do that for a marathon. Instead, we use key training sessions to do that kind of work. So that pacing element becomes really critical. So we've got some loops in there. We're talking a little bit about nutrition. We've got some pacing elements. Another key element from my long run, something that I think about, is timing of food. And I mentioned earlier about sort of like fueling on the run. But for me, long run conditions are successful because I really need to be mindful of my food pre and post workout. I can get on a bike and ride a bike anytime. I can have eaten and ride a bike. I can pretty much just eat and still swim. The whole sort of tale about cramps and so on, not an issue. But for the run, my stomach's really sensitive. And if I have not done a good job with spacing out my nutrition, then I can really undermine that long workout before I even start. And so preparation for my long run and long run success actually starts the night before, when I start figuring out what time my long run is going to be, and I'm looking at that weather, right? But I'm also then figuring out, okay, if I'm really going to start my long run at 6 a.m. because that's what life is giving me, then I've got to make sure that I'm done eating by like 5 at the latest, so that I can be ready to run not easily, but more comfortably than I would otherwise. And that's really important, because I think a lot of people won't plan out that nutrition piece accordingly. They'll get the run, they'll be ready. I've got a 2-hour run, I've got 2 hours to do it. I'm gonna nail this workout. I know the weather, I'm gonna negative split it, let's go. And then disaster strikes 2 miles into that run as their stomach turns south. And that's something for us to think about in terms of real importance as an athlete, because we have to be smart about what the limitations of our body are. And a huge piece of it is the nutritional side and setting ourselves up for success. So that long run nutrition for me, I need to eat something, and typically it's about an hour before I go out for a run. Doesn't need to be a lot of food, it just needs to be enough food to kind of sustain me in the beginning part of that run, because I'm still eating and drinking on my long run as I would in the race itself. So eating and drinking while running is important. I'm not eating my breakfast to preclude what I'm doing, but I'm eating my breakfast to make sure that the beginning of my run, and ergo the end of my run, will be more successful. So that fueling window becomes important as well. Similarly, hydration matters as well. So for most people, long runs happen on the weekend. So does hanging out, so does having a couple drinks, and so on. If you go do a long run after a night of having a couple extra drinks, that long run's going to suffer because of the dehydration status that you're in. So you have to plan accordingly. So going out the night before a long run, have a blast. However, I'd recommend every time you drink a beer, when you're done, have a big glass of water as well. Like, let's keep that hydration piece going. Like, sure, You can be a terrible person to have a conversation with because you're going to the bathroom every 3 minutes. But regardless, you'll be ready for that long run and more prepared for it. So really taking the time to plan out that nutritional aspect of your long run, I think is super important. And then last and, sort of more fun side of the long run is really identifying those key long runs for yourself. So in a training cycle of 12 weeks of race prep, you've got 10 weeks of long runs. Then we want to make sure that we've got some good long runs in there to make sure that we're going to be successful. And a couple of them are important. Inside Endurance Nation, we do race simulation workouts. So you've got 1 or 2 longer runs that are meant to be run at a specific pace or for a certain distance, and that is the goal that we have. So we want to highlight those runs on your training calendar and make sure that you know that, June 16th or September 9th is the big run day, and that's what we want to do. That's what we want to achieve, and share that out. Share it with your friends and training partners so they can help hold you accountable. I remember when my kids were younger, when I would do my last long run before a marathon, they would come out and cheer me on at the end because it's a big deal, and this is an important step forward in the milestone. You want to have fun with it. You want to you want to mark the achievement there as part of marking that progression to your race. So don't just let it all be charts and darts and numbers. Know that we want to be consistent across these long runs. We want to string them together. Want to be smart about them in terms of pacing and nutrition and understanding the constraints and whether and where we want to operate or where we should operate to be maximum for success. But ultimately, we want to be positively focused as well and say, hey, I did it. When I first started this training cycle, I couldn't run more than 8 miles. Now I ran a 16-mile long run. It's my last long run before this 20-mile race, before this marathon, whatever it is. Congratulations. Stop for a second, celebrate that day, celebrate what you achieved there. You've got more to go on race day for sure, but we still want to have that intermediary space where we can say, I've been successful because of all the things that I've done. I really believe that positive mindset as well is an important component to becoming a better athlete, because we need that intermediary reward and that opportunity to reflect. When we do that kind of positive reflection, it gives us the bandwidth, it gives us permission to consider the negative, to consider opportunities to grow. And I like it coming from a positive place, because if you're just negatively focused, then you're constantly kind of picking away and saying, this was wrong, this was bad, this wasn't good, I can do better, what's wrong with me? And while that may be an effective short-term strategy, over the long term, self-doubt is probably the biggest enemy that endurance athletes have on race day. And the last thing we want to do is give it lots of oxygen in our training to make it stronger for when race day comes. This has been Coach Patrick talking long runs this week. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next week with another episode. Who knows what the heck I'll be talking about, but you will be the first to hear it. I'll see you guys online or at the races.